The scream echoes through marble corridors, then silence. Only the distant roar of hungry lions fills the void where a human voice once pleaded for mercy. In the blood-soaked sands of ancient amphitheaters, power took its most twisted form, where the line between justice and sadism dissolved into crimson dust, and where the entertainment of the masses became the currency of absolute authority. This is the story of how Rome's pursuit of spectacle birthed monsters who wore crowns. How the very institution meant to dispense justice became a theater of unimaginable cruelty, and how one empress transformed the sacred act of judgment into her personal playground of death. Rome in the 1st century AD was an empire drunk on its own power. Stretching from the fog-shrouded coasts of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, it commanded the known world through a combination of military might and psychological warfare. But perhaps nowhere was this warfare more visceral than in the amphitheaters that dotted the empire like festering wounds. The practice had humble beginnings. What started as funeral games to honor the dead gradually mutated into something far more sinister. The Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. 3 words that struck terror into the hearts of criminals, slaves, and political prisoners alike. The condemned would be dragged into the arena's blazing sun, their wrists bound, their fate sealed. Trapdoors would burst open with mechanical precision, releasing starved lions, bears, and leopards into the sandy killing floor. The crowd would roar louder than the beasts themselves, thirsting for blood as much as any predator below. But this was justice, the Romans told themselves. This was order. Beneath the Colosseum lay a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, and pulleys known as the hypogeum. Here, in perpetual darkness, wild animals paced in cramped cells while human beings awaited their turn to die. The engineering was remarkable, a marvel of Roman innovation dedicated entirely to orchestrating death. Elevators powered by counterweights could launch a fully grown African lion 30 feet into the air in seconds. Trapdoors opened with split-second timing. Water could flood sections of the arena to recreate naval battles, only to drain away minutes later, leaving behind the carnage of mock warfare made devastatingly real. The logistics were staggering. Ships arrived weekly at Roman ports, their holds filled with exotic predators captured from the furthest reaches of the empire. Bears from the Germanic forests, lions from the North African plains, leopards from the mountains of Anatolia. Each animal represented weeks of dangerous hunting, careful transport, and enormous expense, all to provide a few minutes of blood-soaked entertainment. The human cost was equally calculated: slaves who had attempted escape, Christians who refused to renounce their faith, political prisoners whose only crime was opposition to imperial will, petty criminals whose punishment far exceeded their transgressions, all fodder for the insatiable appetite of the mob. But among all the emperors and empresses who presided over these spectacles, one figure stands apart in the annals of cruelty. Historical accounts, fragmented and scattered though they may be, speak of an imperial woman whose appetite for human suffering exceeded even Rome's brutal standards. She would take her place in the imperial box, draped in purple silk and adorned with jewelry worth more than entire provinces. Her face, painted white with lead-based cosmetics that slowly poisoned her, even as she poisoned the souls of those around her, would remain eerily calm as the slaughter began below. Unlike other rulers who viewed the games as a necessary evil, a way to maintain order through fear, she genuinely delighted in the terror. Witnesses spoke of how her eyes would brighten when a particularly creative execution was announced, how she would lean forward in her seat when the beasts were released, studying each victim's final moments with the intensity of a scholar. She didn't simply attend the games, she choreographed them. Power corrupts, but absolute power over life and death corrupts absolutely. What began as occasional attendance at traditional games slowly transformed into something far more sinister. Private executions were arranged for her personal entertainment. Prisoners were brought before her not for trial, but for her amusement. She would study each condemned soul like an artist examining a blank canvas, considering how best to orchestrate their demise. Some were fed to lions immediately, a mercy in hindsight. Others were tormented for hours, forced to run from one predator only to stumble into the path of another. Still others were partially wounded and left to crawl across the sand while wild dogs nipped at their heels. The Empress kept detailed records, scribes noted with growing horror. She documented which animals killed most efficiently, which victims provided the most entertaining deaths. Which combinations of predator and prey yielded the greatest screams from the crowd? Her servants spoke in whispers of banquets where she would describe the day's executions in loving detail between courses of peacock and wine, how she would mime the final gestures of the condemned, laughing as she reenacted their pleas for mercy. But the Empress's appetite grew beyond simple executions. She began to stage elaborate scenarios, turning death into performance art. Prisoners were dressed as mythological figures and forced to reenact classical stories, with one crucial difference. The deaths were real. A man might be cast as Orpheus, given a lyre, and told to charm the beasts with his music. When the song inevitably failed to tame hungry lions, his screams would be met with applause from the imperial box. Women were dressed as Diana the Huntress, given blunt spears, and expected to fight off packs of wolves with nothing but inadequate weapons and desperate courage. Children, for even the young were not spared when their parents had displeased the crown, were costumed as various woodland creatures and released among actual predators. The Empress would clap her jeweled hands together as if watching a delightful pantomime rather than witnessing infanticide. The crowd, initially shocked by these elaborate cruelties, gradually became inured to them. What had once horrified now merely entertained. The boundary between civilization and barbarism didn't just blur. It vanished entirely. Rome's appetite for blood was not sustainable. The empire's resources were being drained not just by military campaigns, but by the enormous cost of capturing, transporting, and maintaining the exotic animals required for these spectacles. Entire species were driven to near extinction to feed the amphitheater's endless hunger. The North African lion, once the king of predators, became increasingly rare as ship after ship carried them to Rome's arenas. Forests were emptied of bears. Mountains were stripped of their leopards. The ecological devastation mirrored the moral devastation occurring in the empire's heart. But perhaps more significantly, the constant exposure to extreme violence was corrupting Roman society itself. Citizens who could watch children torn apart by wild animals without flinching found it increasingly easy to accept violence in their daily lives. Domestic brutality increased. Slave murders became commonplace. The very fabric of civilization was unraveling, thread by bloody thread. Philosophers of the time warned that Rome was eating itself alive, consuming its own moral foundation in pursuit of ever more extreme pleasures. But their voices were drowned out by the roar of the crowd and the growl of hungry beasts. Even absolute power has its limits. As news of the Empress's excesses spread throughout the empire, unrest began to simmer in the provinces. Local governors, themselves no strangers to brutality, were horrified by reports from the capital. Religious leaders, both pagan and Christian, began to speak openly of divine retribution. The Empress herself, poisoned slowly by the lead in her cosmetics and driven mad by her own cruelty, began to see enemies everywhere. Her paranoia grew until she trusted no one. Not her guards, not her servants, not even her own family. She ordered executions not just for entertainment, but out of imagined slights and perceived threats. The palace became a tomb populated by the living dead. Servants who knew that any mistake might be their last. Courtiers who smiled while plotting rebellion, and guards who protected a woman they despised. Fear ruled every corner of the imperial residence, and that fear would ultimately prove to be her undoing. The end, when it came, was swift, but not merciful. A conspiracy of senators, generals, and even family members moved against the Empress with the cold efficiency of a military campaign. But in a final twist of ironic justice, they didn't simply execute her. They gave her a taste of her own medicine. The arena she had used as her personal theater of cruelty became her final stage. Stripped of her purple robes and golden jewelry, she was dragged into the same sand where so many had died for her entertainment. The crowd that had once cheered her bloodlust now howled for her blood. But the conspirators understood symbolism. They didn't release lions or bears. Instead, they chose creatures that matched her nature. Hyenas, scavengers that fed on the dead and dying, animals that laughed as they killed, just as she had laughed at the suffering of others. The irony was not lost on the crowd. The woman who had orchestrated so many theatrical deaths found herself the star of the ultimate performance. Her screams, which had once been music to her ears when they came from others, now provided the soundtrack to her own demise. The Empress died as she had lived, in violence, surrounded by bloodthirsty spectators, her final moments choreographed for the entertainment of others. But her death did not end the cycle of cruelty she had perfected. The precedent had been set. The boundaries had been crossed. The very concept of human dignity had been fed to the beasts along with her victims. Rome would continue its blood sports for centuries more, each generation finding new ways to torment the condemned, new methods to extract screams from the dying. The Empress had been just one monster in a system that created monsters, but she had been a particularly efficient one, refining cruelty into an art form that would inspire imitators long after her bones had turned to dust. Archaeological excavations of Roman amphitheaters still uncover evidence of these spectacles: scoring marks on stone walls where claws scraped desperately for purchase, drainage systems designed to wash away blood, mechanical devices built solely to inflict maximum suffering. The stones themselves seem to remember the screams. History judges harshly those who mistake power for permission to destroy. The Empress, who fed live prisoners to wild beasts for her amusement, believed that her position placed her above moral law, above human decency, above the very bonds that hold civilization together. She was wrong. Her name, deliberately obscured by historians who found her too shameful to record clearly, serves as a reminder that some acts are so heinous they deserve to be forgotten along with their perpetrators. But the lessons of her cruelty must not be forgotten. They whisper to us across the centuries, warning that the distance between civilization and barbarism is always shorter than we think. Every society faces the choice between justice and vengeance, between order and cruelty, between entertainment and exploitation. The Empress chose wrong at every turn, and her choices created ripples of suffering that extended far beyond her own lifetime. In the end, she became what she had always been: food for beasts. But the beasts that consumed her were not lions or bears. They were the very forces of history itself, which devour those who devour others, which judge those who mistake mercy for weakness, and which remember the screams of the innocent long after the laughter of their tormentors has been silenced. The sand that once ran red with the blood of her victims has long since blown away on Mediterranean winds, but the stain on human conscience remains, a permanent reminder that the price of absolute power is absolute corruption.